Detective Miles Corbin stepped out of his unmarked car, his sharp gaze sweeping over the quiet, affluent neighborhood. The street was lined with pristine lawns and grand homes, their facades bathed in the warm amber glow of streetlights. But the peace was a facade. The police cordon surrounding the largest house on the block shattered any illusion of tranquility. Officers moved purposefully, their radios crackling with clipped updates as they secured the scene. Corbin adjusted his coat, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had seen countless crime scenes in his career, but something about this one felt off. The victim was a prominent judge, a man known for his unshakable integrity and high-profile rulings. His body was discovered in his study, slumped over his desk with a single gunshot wound to the chest. The air inside the room was thick with the sharp tang of cleaning agents, mingling uneasily with the metallic scent of blood. Corbin's eyes swept the space, taking in every detail. The bookshelves were meticulously arranged, each volume perfectly aligned. But the rest of the room told a different story. Papers were scattered across the floor, a chair was overturned, and a shattered glass lay near the desk. It was chaos, but not the kind born of a struggle. It was chaos manufactured to tell a lie. Corbin crouched beside the body, his gloved hand hovering over the wound. No powder burns. The shot had been fired from a distance, yet the gun lay conspicuously close to the judge's hand. Suicide? He doubted it. The scene was too carefully constructed, the details too deliberate. He leaned in closer, catching a faint whiff of bleach. Someone had tried to clean up, but they hadn't done a thorough job. Amateurs. Or perhaps, someone in a hurry. Either way, they had left him breadcrumbs, and Corbin was an expert at following trails others couldn't see. Outside, Corbin questioned the first responders. A neighbor had called 911 after hearing what sounded like a gunshot, but no one had seen anything. The house was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. Yet the eerie calm of the scene, coupled with the faint odor of bleach, told Corbin that someone had been there, someone who wanted to erase their presence. "Sweep the house," he ordered, his voice steady but firm. "Every corner, every crevice. Whoever did this left something behind, even if they don't know it yet." Back at the precinct, Corbin and his team began piecing together the judge's final hours. His calendar was packed with meetings, many of them involving local politicians and influential figures. A man like him didn't live a simple life, and his death wouldn't have a simple explanation. They dug into his phone records, finding an unusual number of calls to an untraceable burner phone. Corbin's instincts flared. Burners were for people with something to hide. He added it to his growing list of leads, knowing that this particular thread would likely lead him deeper into the shadows than he cared to go. The next morning, Corbin visited the judge's widow, Evelyn. She was a striking woman, her composure a thin veneer over barely contained grief. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands trembled as she spoke, but she maintained an air of dignity. "I was at work that night," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I came home to this nightmare. I don't understand." He was a good man. Corbin studied her carefully. Her words were measured, but her body betrayed her. She wasn't wearing her wedding ring, and her left hand bore a faint bruise, hastily concealed with makeup. "Mrs. Clark," Corbin said gently, "are you sure there's nothing else you'd like to tell me?" Her eyes flashed with something, fear. Anger? It was gone before he could pin it down. "I've told you everything," she said, her voice sharper now. "He was my husband. I didn't know anything was wrong." Corbin pressed on. Evelyn admitted that her husband had been distant in recent weeks, his behavior increasingly erratic. She suspected he was having an affair, though she had no proof. "He was always on the phone," she said bitterly. "Whispering. Secrets. I thought I knew him," but her voice trailed off, and for a moment, Corbin saw not just grief but rage simmering beneath the surface. It was a look he had seen before, in people who had been betrayed by those they loved most. Evelyn revealed that she had hired a private investigator weeks ago, desperate to uncover the truth. She handed Corbin a folder, her hands shaking as she did. "I didn't have time to go through it all," she said. "But it's all in there." Corbin took the file, feeling the weight of her desperation. Back at the precinct, he pored over the investigator's report. The judge had been meeting a woman at a rundown motel on the edge of the city. The photos were grainy but clear enough to show his face and hers. A tattoo on her wrist caught Corbin's attention. It was a flower, intricately detailed and unlike any he had seen before. Something about it felt wrong. Ritualistic. Corbin dug deeper, tracing the tattoo to a local group known for their interest in the occult. The judge's mistress wasn't just a mistress, she was part of something much darker. The motel's owner confirmed her name, Sarah. She was intense, he said, his voice low and wary. Always talking about some artifact she was looking for. Said it was important, like life or death. Corbin's unease grew. This was no ordinary affair. The judge had been entangled in something far more sinister than marital betrayal. A call from the lab brought new revelations. The burner phone was linked to a local antique store, a place known for dealing in rare and unusual items. Corbin visited the shop, its dusty shelves packed with relics from another time. The owner, a jittery man with darting eyes, denied any knowledge of the judge, but couldn't explain why his ledger included transactions with both Sarah and the judge. One entry stood out, a ceremonial dagger, purchased just days before the murder. Corbin followed the trail to a flower shop, where Sarah had bought the same rare flower inked on her wrist. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was chilling. Sarah wasn't just a mistress or a treasure hunter. She was a manipulator, weaving a web of lies and pulling the judge into her orbit for reasons that were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly dangerous. Corbin decided it was time to confront Sarah directly. He and his team stormed her apartment, finding her waiting, calm and composed. "Detective," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I've been expecting you." Her confession spilled out in waves, each word more chilling than the last. She had used the judge, drawn him into her twisted quest for power. The artifact she sought was no mere trinket, it was said to hold the key to unimaginable influence, buried deep beneath the city in ancient tunnels. "You think you've caught me," Sarah said, her smile cold and unyielding. "But I've already won. The judge was just a pawn, and so are you." Corbin felt the weight of her words, but he refused to let them sink in. He pressed her for details, piecing together the story of her obsession. Flashbacks filled in the gaps, Sarah and the judge, their affair born of mutual ambition and greed, their partnership descending into betrayal and murder. Sarah's calm facade cracked as Corbin pushed her further, revealing the depths of her desperation. She had made deals with dangerous people, promising them power in exchange for their help. But in the end, she had overplayed her hand. Corbin saw it in her eyes, the fear of someone who had lost control of the chaos she had unleashed. The confrontation turned violent. Sarah fought with a ferocity born of desperation, but Corbin was ready. The battle was brutal, their struggle tearing through the apartment as secrets spilled out like blood. In the end, it was Corbin who stood victorious, Sarah's lifeless body a testament to the darkness she had embraced. But the victory was hollow. The artifact was still out there, its legend casting a long shadow over the city. As Corbin stared at Sarah's fallen form, he knew this was far from over. Justice had been served, but the fight against the darkness was only beginning. The call came just as he stepped outside, a new crime, a new victim, and a new mystery. Corbin squared his shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. The city's secrets were endless, but so was his resolve. Corbin stood on the apartment balcony, his hands gripping the cold metal railing as he stared out at the sprawling city below. The twinkling lights stretched endlessly into the horizon, masking the dark underbelly that he knew all too well. He had won this battle, but the war felt far from over. Sarah's chilling words lingered in his mind, "I've already won." They weren't just the ramblings of a manipulative woman, they were a warning. somewhere in the labyrinth of streets and shadows, the artifact she had been seeking still existed, and with it, the power she had been so desperate to obtain. Corbin had no doubt someone else would come for it, just as she had. Back at the precinct, Corbin sifted through the files from Sarah's apartment. His team worked tirelessly around him, piecing together the remnants of her life. The name of the artifact kept surfacing, a ceremonial dagger, rumored to be tied to ancient rituals and a secret society that had operated in the city for decades, maybe even centuries. It was a lead, but it wasn't enough. Corbin needed to understand the full scope of what he was dealing with, and for that, he needed an expert. He reached out to an old contact, Dr. Eleanor Price, a historian specializing in occult artifacts. They met the next day in her cluttered office at a local university. Books and artifacts lined the shelves, the air thick with the scent of old paper and incense. "Miles," she said, adjusting her glasses as she examined the photos of the dagger. "This isn't just any artifact. If it's what I think it is, you're dealing with something far bigger than a simple murder." "What do you mean?" Corbin asked, his voice steady but his heart racing. Dr. Price leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "The dagger is part of a legend tied to an ancient order known as the Sons of Ether. They believed the dagger held the power to control the balance between light and darkness. It's said to be a key to unlocking something. What, exactly, I don't know. But if Sarah was after it, she wasn't the only one. Others will come, Miles, and they won't stop until they have it." Corbin felt a chill run down his spine. He had always thought of himself as a man who dealt in facts and evidence, but the lines between reality and myth were beginning to blur. "Do you know where it is?" he asked. Dr. Price shook her head. "No. But if Sarah found clues, they'd likely lead to the city's underground tunnels. They've been sealed off for years, but they're a treasure trove of history and danger." Armed with this new information, Corbin returned to the precinct, where his team had uncovered another lead. The phone records from Sarah's burner phone pointed to a series of calls made to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Corbin knew it was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. The warehouse loomed like a specter in the darkness, its broken windows and crumbling walls a testament to years of neglect. Corbin and his team moved cautiously, flashlights cutting through the shadows as they searched for any sign of recent activity. They found it in the form of a makeshift altar, adorned with candles, strange symbols, and a single black rose, the same flower tattooed on Sarah's wrist. "This just keeps getting better," one of the officers muttered, his voice tinged with unease. Corbin examined the altar, his mind racing. Whoever had been here was gone now, but they had left behind something important, a map. It was crude and incomplete, but it clearly marked several locations across the city, with one spot circled in red. Corbin knew he had to move quickly. The map led him to an old church in a forgotten corner of the city. Its towering spires and stained glass windows were beautiful but foreboding, casting eerie patterns on the ground below. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence, the only sound the soft creak of his footsteps on the wooden floor. He found the entrance to the tunnels in the basement, hidden behind a false wall. The passage was narrow and dark, the air damp and suffocating. Corbin's flashlight illuminated the rough stone walls as he descended, each step taking him further from the world above. The tunnels stretched on endlessly, a maze of twists and turns that seemed designed to confuse and disorient. As he moved deeper, Corbin felt the weight of history pressing down on him. These tunnels had seen centuries of secrets, and now they were about to reveal one more. He finally reached a chamber that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. At its center was a pedestal, and on it lay the dagger. Corbin approached cautiously, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back. The dagger was beautiful and terrifying, its blade etched with symbols he couldn't begin to understand. But before he could reach it, a voice echoed through the chamber. "You shouldn't be here, detective." Corbin spun around, his flashlight landing on a figure cloaked in shadows. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face obscured by a hood. "Who are you?" Corbin demanded, his hand moving to his gun. The question, the man said, stepping closer, is not who I am, but who you are. Do you truly understand the forces you're meddling with? I'm here for the truth, Corbin said, his voice unwavering. The man laughed, a cold, hollow sound. The truth? The truth is a dangerous thing, detective. It has the power to destroy and to corrupt. Leave now, while you still can. But Corbin didn't leave. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man's. I've come too far to turn back now. The tension in the chamber was palpable as the two men faced off, each waiting for the other to make a move. Finally, the man sighed. Very well, he said. But know this, the dagger is not just an artifact. It's a key. And once it's used, there's no going back. With that, the man disappeared into the shadows, leaving Corbin alone with the dagger and the weight of his decision. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the hilt. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Corbin's radio crackled to life, breaking the spell. Detective, we've got a situation, his partner's voice said, urgency cutting through the static. Another body. Same symbols as the warehouse. Corbin hesitated, the dagger heavy in his hand. He knew he was standing at a crossroads, and whichever path he chose would change everything. But there was no time to dwell on it now. He pocketed the dagger and turned back toward the tunnel entrance, ready to face whatever came next. As he emerged into the night, the city stretched out before him, its lights flickering like stars against the darkness. The battle was far from over, and Corbin knew the stakes had never been higher. Whatever secrets the dagger held, they were about to drag him into a fight he wasn't sure he could win. But one thing was certain, he wouldn't stop until the truth was uncovered, no matter the cost. Corbin barely had time to process the weight of the dagger in his pocket before jumping into his car, the radio still crackling with updates from his team. Another body. Another crime scene. The city wasn't giving him time to catch his breath. He gunned the engine, the tires screeching as he sped through the narrow streets. The dagger felt heavier with every turn, as though it carried the burden of everything Sarah had warned him about. When he arrived at the new scene, it was chaos. Flashing lights from squad cars painted the walls of the alley in alternating blue and red hues. Uniformed officers milled about, their faces tense. Corbin pushed his way through the crowd, his heart sinking as he caught sight of the body. The victim was a middle-aged man, dressed in a suit that suggested wealth and status. His hands were neatly folded over his chest, and a playing card rested between his lifeless fingers, the Queen of Hearts. Corbin crouched beside the body, his sharp eyes scanning for anything out of place. The symbols from the warehouse altar had been crudely drawn on the wall above the victim in what appeared to be blood. This is a message, Corbin muttered, mostly to himself. His partner, Detective Hayes, stepped up beside him. It's the second one tonight, she said, her voice grim. Same setup. Same card. Different victim. Who is he? Corbin asked, rising to his feet. Martin Whitaker, Hayes replied, flipping through her notepad. Real estate developer. Big name in the city. Rumored to have ties to the Costello crime family. Corbin's mind raced. The Costellos were one of the city's most powerful criminal syndicates, and Sarah had mentioned them during her final moments. Her death hadn't ended the chaos, it had only ignited it. There's more, Hayes continued, lowering her voice. A witness saw someone leaving the alley about 10 minutes before we got here. A woman. Dark hair. Pale skin. Sound familiar? Corbin's stomach tightened. Sarah was dead, he had seen it himself. But the description matched her perfectly. Was it someone connected to her? Or was this a deliberate attempt to mess with his head? Either way, he couldn't ignore the growing feeling that someone was pulling the strings, orchestrating events from the shadows. Back at the precinct, Corbin spread out the evidence on the conference room table. Photos of the two victims, the playing cards, the symbols, they seemed like pieces of a puzzle that stubbornly refused to fit together. His team worked tirelessly, chasing down leads and analyzing the crime scenes, but progress was slow. Every answer they found only led to more questions. The dagger sat in a locked evidence box on Corbin's desk, its presence a constant reminder of the stakes. He hadn't told anyone about it, not even Hayes. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the look in the hooded man's eyes when he had warned Corbin about its power. Or maybe it was the nagging feeling that the dagger was the key to everything, and handing it over would mean losing control of the investigation. Days blurred into nights as Corbin delved deeper into the city's underworld. He questioned informants, studied ancient texts provided by Dr. Price, and followed every lead, no matter how tenuous. The playing cards, the symbols, the victims, all of it pointed to something larger, something ancient and insidious. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a routine interview with a low-level thug who had worked for the Costello family. The man was jittery, his eyes darting around the interrogation room as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "I don't know nothing," he insisted, his voice trembling. Corbin leaned in, his voice cold and steady. "You know something. 2 people are dead, and you're gonna tell me why." The thug hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's the Queen," he finally blurted out. "The Queen?" Corbin repeated, his heart pounding. "Yeah," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That's what they call her. She's been running things ever since Sarah went down. It's like she's picking up where Sarah left off." "Who is she?" Corbin demanded. "I don't know her real name," the thug stammered. "But she's got people everywhere. Costellos, politicians, cops, you name it. She's looking for something. Something big. And she'll kill anyone who gets in her way." Corbin's mind raced as he processed the information. The Queen. Another player in the game, and one who seemed even more dangerous than Sarah. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was connected to the dagger, that she was the one orchestrating the murders and sending the playing cards as a message. The next step was clear. Corbin needed to find the Queen, and to do that, he needed to get inside the Costello family. It wasn't easy. The Costellos were notoriously secretive, their operations protected by layers of loyal soldiers and a code of silence. But Corbin was relentless. He worked his contacts, leaned on informants, and eventually managed to secure a meeting with one of the family's lieutenants, a man named Dominic Russo. The meeting took place in a dimly lit bar on the edge of the city. Russo was a wiry man with sharp features and a perpetual sneer. He sipped his whiskey as he studied Corbin, his eyes calculating. "You've got guts, Detective," Russo said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Coming here like this. What do you want?" "I want the Queen," Corbin said bluntly. "And I know the Costellos are working with her." Russo's expression darkened. "Careful, Detective. You're treading on dangerous ground." "I'm already in it," Corbin shot back. 2 people are dead, and I'm not stopping until I find out why." For a moment, Russo said nothing, his gaze locked on Corbin's. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he leaned back in his chair. "All right," he said. "I'll tell you what I know. But if this gets back to me, you're a dead man." Corbin nodded, his jaw tight. "The Queen's real name is Isabella Marquez," Russo said. "But everyone calls her Izzy. She used to run with Sarah, back when they were nobodies. But when Sarah went down, Izzy stepped up. She's got ambition, Detective. And she's got her sights set on something big." "The dagger," Corbin said, his voice low. Russo's eyes flickered with recognition. "Yeah. She thinks it's the key to Taquin over the city. She's got everyone working for her, Costellos, politicians, even some of your own people. You don't stand a chance." Corbin's mind whirled as he processed the information. Isabella Marquez, the Queen, was the puppet master behind it all. She was the one Sarah had warned him about, the one who had picked up the pieces of Sarah's plan and turned them into her own. But Corbin wasn't intimidated. He had faced monsters before, and he wasn't about to back down now. The game was changing, and he was ready to play. As he left the bar, the dagger weighed heavily in his pocket. It was time to confront the Queen, to end the game once and for all. But deep down, Corbin knew the battle was just beginning. The city's darkness was deeper than he had ever imagined, and the fight for its soul was far from over. Corbin drove through the city streets, the glow of streetlights flashing rhythmically against his windshield. His mind raced as he pieced together everything he'd learned. Isabella Marquez, Izzy, was the queen pulling the strings, orchestrating the murders, and sending the playing cards as her calling card. She had inherited Sarah's schemes and expanded them, weaving a web of power that stretched across the city. And now, she was after the dagger. Corbin knew that if she got her hands on it, the consequences would be catastrophic. His first stop was the precinct. He needed backup, but more importantly, he needed to test the loyalty of his team. Russo's warning about dirty cops lingered in his mind, and the last thing he needed was a mole feeding information back to Izzy. He summoned Hayes to his office, closing the door behind her. "Hayes, I need someone I can trust," Corbin said, his voice low. "I'm about to go after Izzy, and if Russo's right, she's got people on the inside." Hayes crossed her arms, her expression hard. "You think I'd sell you out?" "No," Corbin said quickly. "But I think someone might. I'm telling you this because I need someone to watch my back. Can I count on you?" Hayes nodded without hesitation. "You know you can." Corbin handed her a folder containing everything he'd gathered on Izzy. "I'm going to flush her out. While I'm doing that, I need you to keep an eye on the precinct. If anyone so much as breathes in her direction, I want to know about it." Hayes took the folder and gave him a firm nod. "Be careful, Miles. She's dangerous." "Yeah," Corbin said, his hand brushing the pocket where the dagger rested. "But so am I." The next morning, Corbin followed a lead to a high-end nightclub owned by the Costello family. It was the kind of place where power players came to drink, deal, and disappear. If Izzy was running things, this was where she'd be. The bouncer at the door gave him a skeptical look, but a flash of his badge got him inside. The club was a sensory overload, pounding music, flashing lights, and a haze of cigarette smoke. Corbin moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. He spotted Dominic Russo at the bar, nursing a drink and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Corbin approached him, leaning in close to be heard over the music. "Russo," Corbin said. "Where's Izzy?" Russo flinched, his eyes darting around nervously. "Are you out of your mind? This place is crawling with her people." "Then you'd better talk fast," Corbin said, his voice cold. "Because if I find out you've been holding out on me, the Costellos are going to be the least of your problems." Russo hesitated for a moment before leaning in. "She's got a safe house across town. Abandoned warehouse near the docks. But you didn't hear it from me." Corbin straightened, giving Russo a hard look. "If you're lying, I'll be back." With that, he turned and left the club, his heart pounding. If the lead was good, he'd finally have a chance to confront Izzy. But if it was a trap, he'd be walking straight into her hands. The warehouse loomed over the docks like a sleeping giant, its rusted metal exterior battered by years of neglect. Corbin parked a block away, slipping his gun from its holster as he approached. The air was thick with the smell of salt and oil, the distant sound of waves crashing against the pier. He circled the building, looking for any sign of movement. The windows were dark, but a faint glow seeped through the cracks in one of the doors. Someone was inside. Corbin slipped through the shadows, his footsteps silent on the damp pavement. He found an unlocked side door and slipped inside, his gun raised. The interior of the warehouse was cavernous, filled with crates and machinery coated in a thick layer of dust. The faint glow he'd seen from outside came from a makeshift office at the far end of the building. Corbin crept toward it, his every sense on high alert. The door to the office was ajar, and Corbin could hear voices inside. He paused, straining to make out the conversation. "He's getting too close," a woman's voice said. It was smooth and commanding, with an edge that sent a chill down Corbin's spine. If he finds the dagger, everything we've built will fall apart. Corbin pushed the door open, his gun trained on the figures inside. Izzy stood at the center, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She was dressed in a tailored black suit, her presence radiating power. Beside her stood two men, their hands on their weapons, but neither made a move. "Detective Corbin," Izzy said, her lips curving into a smile. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Hands where I can see them," Corbin said, his voice steady. Izzy raised her hand slowly, her smile never faltering. "You've been busy, haven't you? Digging through the city's shadows, chasing ghosts. But you have no idea what you're dealing with." "I know enough," Corbin said. "You're behind the murders. You've been using the Costellos to do your dirty work, and now you're after the dagger." Izzy's smile widened. "And you're here to stop me? How noble. But tell me, Detective, do you really think you can win?" Corbin's grip tightened on his gun. "I don't care about winning. I care about justice." Izzy laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Justice? There's no justice in this city. Just power. And right now, you're standing in the way of mine." Before Corbin could react, one of Izzy's men lunged at him. The room erupted into chaos as Corbin fired, the sound of gunshots echoing through the warehouse. He took down one of the men, but the other tackled him, sending them both crashing to the floor. Corbin fought to regain control, his hand reaching for the dagger in his pocket. Izzy watched the struggle with a calm detachment, her eyes sharp and calculating. When Corbin finally managed to overpower his attacker, she stepped forward, her hand still raised. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You've proven your point, Detective. You're resourceful. But you're also out of your depth." Corbin rose to his feet, his gun trained on Izzy once more. "It's over, Izzy." She tilted her head, her smile returning. "Oh, Miles. It's just beginning." Before he could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Izzy's expression darkened, and she nodded to her remaining man. "We'll finish this later." She turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Corbin alone in the aftermath. As the sirens grew louder, he knew the fight was far from over. Izzy was still out there, and the dagger in his pocket was a ticking time bomb. The city's darkness loomed larger than ever, and Corbin was running out of time to bring it into the light. Corbin stood in the empty warehouse, the distant wail of sirens drawing closer. His pulse thundered in his ears, his grip on the gun tightening as he replayed the last few moments in his mind. Izzy had slipped through his fingers, vanishing into the shadows like a ghost. She had left him alive, and that worried him. It wasn't mercy, it was strategy. She had plans, and Corbin suspected this wasn't the end of her game, it was only the opening move. The sirens cut off abruptly as squad cars skidded to a halt outside. A team of officers poured into the warehouse, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Hayes was among them, her face a mix of relief and frustration as she spotted Corbin standing in the aftermath. "What the hell happened here?" she demanded, lowering her weapon as she approached him. "Izzy was here," Corbin said, his voice rough. "She had two men with her. I took one down, but she got away." Hayes glanced at the body sprawled on the floor, her jaw tightening. "And the dagger?" Corbin hesitated, his hand brushing his coat pocket. He hadn't told anyone about the dagger, not even Hayes, and he wasn't sure he could start now. There was something about it, something that felt too dangerous to share. "It's safe," he said finally. "For now." Hayes frowned but didn't press him. "We'll sweep the place." "Maybe she left something behind." "She won't have," Corbin said. His voice was edged with frustration, but he knew it was the truth. Izzy was too smart, too careful. She wouldn't leave anything that could lead back to her. As the officers began their search, Corbin stepped outside, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. He leaned against the side of his car, running a hand through his hair as he tried to think. Izzy was still out there, and she wasn't just running, she was planning. The question was, what was her next move? Hours later, Corbin sat in his dimly lit apartment, the dagger resting on the coffee table in front of him. He had locked the door, drawn the blinds, and turned off his phone. The weight of the artifact seemed to fill the room, its etched blade gleaming faintly in the low light. It wasn't just an object, it was a question, a challenge, a threat. Dr. Price's words echoed in his mind. The dagger is a key. And once it's used, there's no going back. What had she meant? What did the dagger unlock? And why had Sarah, Izzy, and now half the city's underworld been so desperate to get their hands on it? Corbin reached for his laptop, pulling up the files he had gathered on the Sons of Ether, the secret society Dr. Price had mentioned. They were a shadowy group, their origins shrouded in mystery. Legend spoke of their rituals, their pursuit of balance between light and darkness, and their belief in the power of the dagger. But the details were maddeningly vague, buried beneath layers of myth and secrecy. One thing was clear: the Sons of Ether had operated in the city's tunnels for centuries, using the labyrinthine passages to conduct their rituals and hide their secrets. If the dagger was truly a key, it was a key to something hidden deep below the city, a secret that had remained buried for generations. Corbin leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Izzy wouldn't wait. She was already ahead of him, moving her pieces across the board with ruthless precision. If he didn't act soon, she would win. The next morning, Corbin met with Dr. Price in her office. She looked tired, her desk cluttered with books and papers as though she hadn't slept since their last conversation. "I need to know what this dagger unlocks," Corbin said, placing the artifact on the desk in front of her. Dr. Price's eyes widened as she stared at it, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to touch it. "You found it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think it was real." "It's real," Corbin said grimly. "And so is the danger it brings. What does it unlock, Eleanor? What are we dealing with?" Dr. Price took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the symbols etched into the blade. The Sons of Ether believed the dagger was a key to the Nexus, a point where the boundaries between light and darkness blur. According to legend, the Nexus is a source of immense power. Whoever controls it can shape reality itself. Corbin's stomach tightened. "And you think it's in the tunnels?" Dr. Price nodded. "If the legends are true, the Nexus is hidden somewhere beneath the city. The Sons of Ether built the tunnels to protect it, to keep it out of the wrong hands. But if Izzy finds it—" "She won't," Corbin said, his voice hardening. "Not if I get there first." Dr. Price hesitated. "Miles, if the Nexus is real, it's not just dangerous. It's corrupting. Even the Sons of Ether couldn't control it. That's why they sealed it away. If you go down there—" "I don't have a choice," Corbin said, cutting her off. "Izzy's not going to stop. And if she gets to the Nexus, this city is finished." Dr. Price sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Then you'll need a guide. The tunnels are a maze. Without a map, you'll never find your way." Corbin's lips twitched in a faint, humorless smile. "I was hoping you'd say that." By nightfall, Corbin and Dr. Price stood at the entrance to the tunnels, a rusted metal gate hidden beneath an overpass. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, the faint sound of dripping water echoing from the darkness below. Corbin adjusted his flashlight, his other hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Are you sure about this?" Dr. Price asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. "No," Corbin admitted. "But I don't see another option." With that, they descended into the tunnels, the world above fading behind them. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, the walls closing in around them like the ribs of some ancient beast. Corbin's flashlight illuminated faded symbols carved into the stone, marks left by the Sons of Ether to guide their way. They moved cautiously, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. The tunnels twisted and turned, branching off into countless passages that seemed to stretch on forever. Dr. Price consulted an old map, her brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of the labyrinth. They had been walking for what felt like hours when they reached a large chamber. At its center stood a stone pedestal, its surface etched with the same symbols as the dagger. Corbin approached it cautiously, the artifact in his hand. "This is it," Dr. Price whispered. "The entrance to the Nexus." Corbin hesitated, his grip tightening on the dagger. He could feel its weight, not just in his hand, but in his mind, as though it was alive, aware of what was about to happen. He glanced at Dr. Price, her wide eyes reflecting both awe and fear. Before he could act, a sound from the darkness made him freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and growing louder. Corbin turned, his flashlight slicing through the shadows to reveal Izzy standing at the edge of the chamber, flanked by 2 armed men. "You've saved me a lot of trouble, Detective," she said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "I knew you'd lead me right to it." Corbin raised his gun, his jaw tightening. "It's over, Izzy." Izzy smirked, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "Oh, Miles. It hasn't even begun." Izzy stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the stone floor of the chamber. Her men followed close behind, their weapons trained on Corbin and Dr. Price. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier with every step she took, as if the dagger itself recognized her presence. "You've been a thorn in my side, Detective," Izzy said, her voice smooth and venomous. "Chasing shadows, uncovering secrets you were never meant to find. But you're here now. Right where I need you." Corbin didn't lower his gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. "You're not getting the dagger." Izzy laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed through the chamber. "Oh, Miles. The dagger isn't mine to take. It's already where it belongs. All that's left is for you to do what you were meant to." Corbin frowned, his grip tightening on the weapon. "What are you talking about?" Izzy tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with something that looked almost like pity. "You think you've been in control of this, don't you? That all of this, the murders, the symbols, the cards, was me pulling the strings. But you've been playing your part just as much as I've been playing mine." Dr. Price took a cautious step back, her voice trembling as she spoke. "She's manipulating you, Miles. Don't listen to her." Izzy's gaze flicked to Dr. Price, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Ah, the scholar. You've read the stories, haven't you? The legends of the dagger and the Nexus. But there's one thing your books never told you: the dagger chooses its wielder. And it's already chosen." Corbin's stomach twisted as her words sank in. He glanced down at the dagger in his hand, its blade still gleaming faintly in the dim light. He had carried it with him for days, feeling its weight, its presence, without ever understanding what it truly meant. Was she right? Had he been playing into her hands all along? "You're lying," Corbin said, his voice firm but laced with doubt. "You want the dagger for yourself." Izzy's smile widened. "Do I? If I wanted the dagger, Detective, I would have taken it from you back in the warehouse. But I didn't, did I? Because it's not mine to take. It's yours. You're the key." Corbin shook his head, his heart pounding. "This is just another one of your games." "Think about it," Izzy said, her voice softening. "Why haven't you handed it over to your superiors? Why haven't you locked it away, or destroyed it? Because deep down, you know the truth. You were meant to find it. To bring it here." Dr. Price stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "Don't listen to her, Miles. She's twisting the truth. She doesn't care about the Nexus or the city, she only cares about power." Izzy sighed, her expression almost disappointed. "Power is a tool, Doctor. And like any tool, it depends on who wields it. Right now, your detective here is the wielder. The question is, what will he do with it?" Corbin's mind raced, his thoughts tangling in a web of doubt and fear. He had spent his entire career chasing justice, fighting to bring light to the city's darkest corners. But now, standing at the threshold of something far greater than himself, he felt utterly lost. The air in the chamber seemed to hum with energy, the symbols on the pedestal faintly glowing as if they were alive. Corbin's hand trembled as he raised the dagger, its blade catching the light in a way that seemed almost otherworldly. "Don't do it," Dr. Price pleaded, her voice breaking. "We don't know what will happen if you use it." Izzy took another step forward, her eyes locked on Corbin's. "You already know what will happen, Miles. You felt it, haven't you? The pull. The connection. The city is dying, Detective. Corruption, violence, decay, it's rotting from the inside out. But with the Nexus, you can fix it. You can bring balance. You can be the light this city so desperately needs." Corbin's breath caught in his throat. Her words struck a chord deep within him, echoing the doubts and fears he had carried for years. He had seen firsthand the darkness that consumed the city, the lives ruined by greed and violence. Was the dagger truly the answer? Could the Nexus give him the power to change everything? But then he remembered the bodies, the judge, Sarah, the victims marked with symbols and playing cards. He remembered the lies and manipulations, the blood spilled in the name of a legend. Could he trust anything Izzy said? Could he trust himself? "I don't want power," Corbin said, his voice shaking. "I want justice." Izzy's smile faltered, a flicker of frustration crossing her face. "Justice is an illusion, Detective. A lie we tell ourselves to make sense of the chaos. But balance, that's real. That's tangible. And you have the chance to bring it." Corbin looked at Dr. Price, her wide eyes filled with fear and desperation. He looked at Izzy, her confident smirk masking the hunger in her gaze. And then he looked at the dagger, its blade glinting with an almost hypnotic allure. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as Corbin made his choice. He stepped forward, the dagger in his hand, and placed it on the pedestal. The glow of the symbols intensified, the air vibrating with a low, resonant hum. Izzy's smirk returned, her eyes gleaming with triumph. But before she could take another step, Corbin spun around, his gun leveled at her chest. "This ends here," he said, his voice steady. Izzy froze, her men shifting uneasily behind her. "You don't understand," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "Without the dagger, the Nexus will remain sealed. The city will keep rotting, and you'll have done nothing to stop it." "Maybe," Corbin said. "But I'm not giving you the chance to prove me wrong." Before Izzy could respond, Corbin pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the chamber as Izzy crumpled to the ground. Her men hesitated for a moment before retreating, their footsteps fading into the darkness. Dr. Price rushed to Corbin's side, her face pale. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Corbin looked at the pedestal, the dagger still glowing faintly. He reached for it, his hand closing around the hilt. "We bury it," he said. "Deep enough that no one will ever find it again." As they left the chamber, the weight of the dagger still heavy in his hand, Corbin couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The city's darkness was vast, its secrets endless. And though he had won this battle, the war for its soul was far from over. The tunnels were silent as Corbin and Dr. Price made their way back toward the surface, the faint glow of the dagger casting eerie shadows on the damp stone walls. Each step echoed in the darkness, a reminder of how far they had descended, not just into the city's underbelly, but into something far older and more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Corbin kept his grip tight on the dagger, its weight feeling heavier now than ever. He had made his choice, but the unease in his chest hadn't lifted. The dagger had been at the center of a web of lies, betrayals, and death. And yet, as he carried it away from the chamber, he couldn't shake the sensation that it wasn't really leaving the Nexus behind. The energy in the tunnel still seemed to hum faintly, as though the place itself was alive, watching them leave. Dr. Price broke the silence, her voice low and hesitant. "Miles, are you sure about this? Burying the dagger might keep it out of Izzy's hands, but it won't erase what it represents. Someone else will come for it." Corbin glanced over his shoulder at her, his expression grim. "I know. But I'm not going to let it destroy anyone else. If we seal it away, make sure no one knows where it is, maybe we can stop this madness. Dr. Price didn't respond right away, her brow furrowed as though she was wrestling with something. Finally, she said, "You felt it, didn't you? The pull. When you placed it on the pedestal." Corbin exhaled slowly. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The truth was written all over his face. The dagger had spoken to him, not in words, but in a way that bypassed language entirely. It had whispered promises of power, of control, of balance. And for a moment, he had considered it. He had imagined what it would feel like to have that kind of influence, to remake the city in his vision of justice. But he had also felt the danger. The dagger wasn't just a tool, it was a temptation, a trap. It didn't offer solutions, it offered corruption. And Corbin had spent too many years fighting against the city's darkness to become a part of it himself. "I felt it," he admitted finally, his voice low. "And that's why we have to get rid of it." They reached the surface just as dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight casting long shadows across the crumbling overpass. Corbin blinked against the sudden brightness, the fresh air a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the tunnels. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in. The city stretched out before him, its skyline jagged and uneven, its streets already coming to life with the chaos of the morning rush. It looked the same as it always did. But it didn't feel the same. Not to Corbin. Dr. Price joined him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though she was trying to ward off the chill. "What now?" she asked softly. Corbin didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the city, his thoughts racing. Finally, he said, "We find a place where no one will ever look. Somewhere even the most desperate treasure hunters wouldn't think to dig." Dr. Price nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "And then what? You just go back to your life? Go back to chasing petty criminals while this thing is still out there, waiting?" Corbin turned to her, his expression hard. "I don't know what my life looks like after this. But I know one thing, I'm not letting this dagger define me. Or this city." Dr. Price didn't press him further. Instead, she simply nodded and started walking toward her car, her movements slow and deliberate. Corbin watched her go, the weight of the dagger, or perhaps the choices he had made, pressing down on him like a lead blanket. For 3 days, Corbin barely slept. He spent hours scouring maps of the city and its surrounding areas, looking for the perfect place to hide the dagger. He considered the tunnels, but they were too obvious. Too many people already knew about them. He thought about the river, but water wouldn't destroy the dagger, and someone might still dredge it up someday. Finally, he settled on an abandoned quarry miles outside the city. It was remote, overgrown, and forgotten, exactly the kind of place where secrets stayed buried. Corbin didn't tell anyone where he was going, not even Hayes or Dr. Price. He couldn't risk it. The fewer people who knew about the dagger's final resting place, the safer it would be. He drove out to the quarry under the cover of night, the dagger locked in the glove compartment of his car. The road was rough and uneven, the headlights cutting through the thick trees that lined the way. When he finally arrived, the scene was almost surreal. The quarry was a massive, gaping wound in the earth, its jagged walls illuminated by the pale light of the moon. The air was still, the only sounds the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. Corbin climbed down into the quarry, the dagger clutched tightly in his hand. He had brought a shovel, a tarp, and a metal lockbox, the kind used for safekeeping valuables. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He found a spot near the base of the quarry, where the ground was firm but not too difficult to dig, and he got to work. The hours passed in silence, the only sounds the scrape of the shovel against the earth and Corbin's own labored breathing. By the time he finished, his arms ached and his shirt was soaked with sweat, but the hole was deep enough to satisfy him. He placed the dagger in the lockbox, sealed it shut, and wrapped it in the tarp before lowering it into the ground. For a moment, he just stood there, staring down at the hole. He thought about everything that had led him here, the murders, the symbols, Izzy's chilling words. He thought about Sarah, the judge, the victims who had been caught in the crossfire of a game they didn't even know they were playing. And then he started filling in the hole. When it was done, he stood over the disturbed earth, his shoulders slumped. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a pause, a moment of quiet in a storm that was far from over. But it was something. It was a start. Back in the city, life went on. The news reported on Izzy's death, speculating about the power vacuum it would leave in the Costello family. Hayes pestered Corbin for answers, but he brushed her off, saying only that the case was closed. Dr. Price sent him a message, asking if the dagger was safe. He responded with a single word, yes. But Corbin knew better than anyone that the city's darkness didn't disappear overnight. It shifted, changed, found new forms. He had buried the dagger, but its influence lingered, a shadow stretching over the city. And somewhere, he knew, someone else would come looking for it. For now, though, Corbin was content to just breathe. To walk the city streets and remind himself why he had fought so hard to protect it. The battle wasn't over, but he was still here. Still fighting. And that would have to be enough. For now. The city was quiet for once, or at least as quiet as it ever got. Corbin walked down a dimly lit street, the faint hum of streetlights overhead creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. His hands were stuffed into the pockets of his coat, his collar turned up against the chilly night air. The sounds of distant traffic and muffled conversations drifted toward him, blending into the ever-present murmur of urban life. But Corbin's mind wasn't on the city tonight. It was on the weight of everything he had buried. The dagger and the secrets tied to it felt like a scar he couldn't see but could still feel. He had done what he believed was right, what he had to do, but the questions wouldn't stop. Had he truly stopped the darkness? Or had he simply delayed it, giving it time to evolve into something worse? He passed a diner with flickering neon lights and paused for a moment, considering going inside. It was late, and the place was nearly empty, save for a lone waitress wiping down the counter and a man hunched over a cup of coffee. Corbin decided against it and kept walking. He wasn't sure what he was looking for out here, but he knew it wasn't in that diner. The next morning, Corbin was back at the precinct, sitting at his desk and staring at the mountain of paperwork that had accumulated while he was chasing the dagger. The mundane grind of police work was almost a relief. Reports, phone calls, and witness statements, all of it felt refreshingly normal compared to what he had been dealing with. But even as he tried to immerse himself in the routine, a nagging feeling lingered at the edge of his thoughts. Hayes appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed and a knowing look on her face. "You've been avoiding me," she said. Corbin didn't look up. "I've been busy." "Busy burying something, I bet," Hayes said as she stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "Whatever it is, you're not as good at hiding it as you think." Corbin sighed and leaned back in his chair, meeting her gaze. "It's better if you don't know, Hayes." "Bull," she shot back, her tone sharper than usual. "I've been your partner for years, Miles. I can tell when you're carrying something heavy. And right now, it's weighing you down so much it's practically written all over your face. So spill it." Corbin hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you want me to say? That there's a part of this city's history we were never supposed to find? That I had to make a choice I'm still not sure was the right one?" Hayes' expression softened, but only a little. "You don't have to give me every detail, but I need to know if whatever you're dealing with is going to come back to bite us." Corbin rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping into his voice. "It's buried, Hayes. Literally. And as far as I'm concerned, that's where it's going to stay." Hayes studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Fine. But if this thing starts creeping back into our lives, you'd better let me know. I'm not letting you carry this alone." Corbin offered a faint smile. "You've got my word." She turned to leave but paused at the door. "By the way, there's been chatter. Some of the Costello crew is reorganizing. Word is, they're trying to fill the power vacuum Izzy left behind." Corbin nodded, though he wasn't surprised. The Costellos wouldn't let their empire crumble just because one leader was gone. They'd find someone new to step up, and the cycle would continue. That was the nature of the city. "Let me know if anything solid comes through," Corbin said. "Will do," Hayes replied before disappearing down the hallway. That evening, Corbin sat in his apartment, staring at the city skyline through the window. The faint glow of his desk lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. He felt restless, like a piece of him had been left behind in the tunnels beneath the city. The dagger had been a symbol of something far larger than himself: power, corruption, and the fragile balance between the two. And though he had buried it, he couldn't shake the feeling that its story wasn't over. The city's darkness had a way of resurfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Corbin frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, too late for visitors. He rose from his chair, his hand instinctively brushing against the gun holstered at his side as he approached the door. He opened it to find Dr. Eleanor Price standing there, her face pale and her expression tense. "Eleanor?" Corbin said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her gaze darting around the room as though she expected someone to be watching. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Corbin closed the door behind her, his brow furrowing. "What's going on?" Dr. Price turned to face him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I've been researching the Nexus since everything. Trying to understand what we were dealing with." Corbin folded his arms, his tone wary. And I think I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The Sons of Ether didn't just build the tunnels to protect the Nexus, they built them to contain it. To keep it from spreading its influence." Corbin felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying?" Dr. Price hesitated, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and guilt. The dagger wasn't just a key to the Nexus. It was also a seal. By removing it, by taking it out of the chamber, we might have weakened the barrier. Corbin's stomach dropped. "You're telling me we might have unleashed something?" "I don't know," Dr. Price admitted. "But I've been hearing things. Whispers of strange occurrences near the tunnels. People disappearing. Shadows moving where they shouldn't. I think the Nexus is waking up." Corbin ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He had thought the danger was over, that burying the dagger had been the end of it. But if Dr. Price was right, he might have only made things worse. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. Dr. Price looked at him, her expression grim. "We go back. And we find a way to seal it, for good this time." Corbin stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had thought he was done with the tunnels, with the dagger, with the darkness that had consumed so much of his life. But the city wasn't done with him. It never was. Corbin leaned against the wall, his jaw tightening as Dr. Price's words settled in. The idea of going back into the tunnels, of confronting the Nexus and whatever it might be unleashing, made his stomach churn. He had buried the dagger not just to hide it but to close that chapter of his life. Yet here it was, clawing its way back to the surface. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Dr. Price nodded, her expression grim. "I wouldn't have come here if I wasn't. The signs are there, Miles. The Nexus is destabilizing. If we don't act now, it could spiral out of control." "What does out of control mean?" Corbin pressed. "What are we talking about here? More disappearances? Violence? Or something worse?" Dr. Price hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "The Nexus isn't just a source of power. It's a point where the boundaries between realities weaken. If it's waking up, I don't know what could happen. But the stories suggest it could draw things into our world. Things we're not prepared to face." Corbin exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "Fantastic. More nightmares." She stepped closer, her voice softening. I know this isn't what you wanted, Miles. But if we don't fix this, the city, and maybe more than just the city, could pay the price. Corbin didn't answer right away. He turned to the window, staring out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, people were going about their lives, oblivious to the danger lurking beneath their feet. He had spent years trying to protect them from the city's darkness, but this was different. This was bigger than crime or corruption. This was something he didn't fully understand, and that terrified him. Finally, he turned back to Dr. Price. All right. We go back. But this time, we do it right. Dr. Price's shoulders sagged in relief, though her face remained tense. We'll need supplies. And we'll need to find the exact point where the Nexus is weakest. The pedestal chamber might not be enough. Corbin nodded. I'll handle the logistics. You focus on figuring out how we seal this thing. For good. Dr. Price gave him a tight smile. I'll start tonight. As she left, Corbin sank into his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The dagger might be buried, but the responsibility wasn't. He had thought he could walk away from this. Now, it seemed, walking away wasn't an option. The next evening, Corbin stood at the edge of the same overpass where he and Dr. Price had entered the tunnels days before. This time, he wasn't alone. Hayes was with him, her expression a mix of skepticism and concern as she adjusted the flashlight strapped to her jacket. This better not be some wild goose chase, Hayes muttered, glancing at the rusted gate that led into the earth. You're dragging me into this, and you still won't tell me what we're really dealing with. Corbin tightened the straps on his pack, avoiding her gaze. It's complicated. It always is with you, Hayes shot back, though her tone lacked real venom. But if this is as dangerous as you're making it sound, I'm not letting you go down there alone. Dr. Price arrived moments later, carrying a bag filled with maps, instruments, and what looked like a journal bound in faded leather. Her face was pale, and dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much, if at all. Are we ready? She asked, her voice tight. As ready as we can be, Corbin replied. He turned to Hayes, his tone softening. Thanks for coming. Hayes waved a hand dismissively. Someone's got to keep you alive. The three of them descended into the tunnels, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. Corbin led the way, his flashlight piercing the thick darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing through the labyrinth. Dr. Price consulted her maps as they walked, her voice a hushed whisper. The disturbances seemed to be concentrated near the lower chambers. If the Nexus is destabilizing, that's where we'll find the source. Great, Hayes muttered. Straight into the lion's den. Corbin didn't respond. His focus was on the path ahead, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. What would they find down there? Could they even stop it? And if they couldn't, what would happen to the city, and to them? Hours later, they reached the pedestal chamber. The air was thick with tension, the faint glow of the symbols on the walls sending a shiver down Corbin's spine. The pedestal itself stood empty, the spot where the dagger had rested now eerily silent. This is where it started, Dr. Price said, her voice barely audible. But it's not where it ends. Hayes glanced around, her hand resting on the holster at her side. I don't like this. It's too quiet. Corbin nodded. He could feel it too, a sense of wrongness, as though the tunnels themselves were holding their breath. Stay alert. Dr. Price knelt by the pedestal, pulling out her maps and journal. She muttered to herself as she worked, tracing lines and symbols with a finger. Corbin and Hayes stood guard, their flashlights sweeping the chamber's edges. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Price straightened, her face pale. There's a deeper chamber, she said. Below this one. That's where the Nexus is weakest. Of course there is, Hayes muttered darkly. Because this wasn't creepy enough already. Corbin glanced at her, his expression grim. You can still turn back. Hayes snorted. Not a chance. They found the entrance to the lower chamber hidden behind a collapsed wall. The passage was narrow and steep, forcing them to move in single file. The air grew colder with every step, the faint sound of whispers brushing against their ears. Corbin couldn't tell if it was real or just his imagination, but it set his nerves on edge. When they finally emerged into the lower chamber, the sight stopped them in their tracks. The room was massive, its walls covered in glowing symbols that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. At the center was a swirling vortex of light and shadow, its edges fraying and flickering like a flame caught in the wind. "The Nexus," Dr. Price whispered, her voice tinged with awe and fear. Corbin stepped forward, his jaw tightening. "How do we stop it?" Dr. Price hesitated, her eyes locked on the swirling chaos. "We need to stabilize the barrier. The dagger was part of the seal, but there might be another way. I just need time to figure it out." "We don't have time," Hayes said, her voice sharp. "Look." Corbin followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Shadows were moving at the edges of the chamber, their shapes shifting and unnatural. They didn't make a sound, but their presence was suffocating, like a pressure building in the air. "We're not alone," Hayes said, drawing her weapon. Corbin drew his own gun, his heart pounding. "Eleanor, whatever you're doing, do it fast." Dr. Price nodded, dropping to her knees and frantically flipping through her journal. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, the whispers growing louder until they were a cacophony that pressed against Corbin's mind. The shadows began to move closer, their forms becoming more distinct, humanoid, but wrong. Their faces were featureless, their movements jerky and unnatural. Corbin fired a warning shot, the sound echoing through the chamber, but the shadows didn't stop. "Eleanor!" Corbin shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I'm trying," Dr. Price cried, her hands shaking as she worked. "I just need—" Before she could finish, the vortex surged, sending a shockwave through the chamber. Corbin staggered, his flashlight flying from his hand as the ground shook beneath him. The shadows surged forward, and Corbin braced himself for the fight of his life. And the Nexus roared. The sound that erupted from the Nexus wasn't something Corbin could describe. It was less a noise and more a force, a deep, resonant roar that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. The swirling vortex of light and shadow expanded, its edges unraveling as if the barrier between worlds was fraying before his eyes. The shadows surged forward, faster now, their inhuman forms bending and twisting as they closed in. "Hayes, cover me!" Corbin shouted, raising his gun and taking aim at the nearest shadow. Hayes, ever the professional, reacted immediately, firing off precise shots. The bullets didn't stop the shadows entirely, but they slowed them down, their forms flickering and recoiling as if the physical world still held some sway over them. Corbin fired alongside her, forcing the creatures back as they advanced in waves. Dr. Price sat on the ground near the pedestal, her hands trembling as she scrawled symbols in the dust with a piece of chalk. She was muttering to herself, her words fragmented and frantic. "It's destabilizing, the barrier is too weak. I need to reinforce the seal. Eleanor, whatever you're doing, you need to do it faster." Corbin barked, barely dodging a swipe from one of the shadows. Its arm, or what passed for an arm, whistled through the air, leaving a cold, unnatural chill in its wake. "I'm trying," she shouted back, her voice cracking under the pressure. "But the seal won't hold without the dagger. It's the central piece of the binding." Corbin's stomach dropped. The dagger. Of course. The one thing he thought he'd left behind, the one thing he'd buried miles away. He couldn't bring himself to admit it to her, not now, not when the chaos around them was spiraling out of control. "Find another way," he demanded, his voice rising over the cacophony of the Nexus's roar and the gunfire echoing through the chamber. Hayes was running low on ammunition. Corbin could hear the click of her near-empty magazine as she reloaded. "We can't keep this up forever, Miles," she called out, her voice raw with strain. "These things just keep coming." Corbin fired his last shot, watching as the nearest shadow dissipated into a puff of darkness before reforming moments later. He gritted his teeth and holstered his weapon, pulling out his flashlight as a makeshift club. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Then something changed. The vortex in the center of the chamber pulsed violently, sending another shockwave through the air. The symbols on the walls flared so brightly that Corbin had to shield his eyes. The shadows froze, their forms flickering and distorting as if caught in some unseen force. For a brief moment, the chamber was eerily still, the only sound the low hum of the Nexus. Dr. Price's eyes widened as she stared at the vortex. "It's reacting to the seal," she said, her voice trembling. "But it's not enough. I need the dagger, Miles. Without it, I can't stabilize the Nexus." Corbin felt his chest tighten. He had buried the dagger in that quarry for a reason. Bringing it back here would undo everything he had tried to protect. But as he looked around the chamber, at the flickering shadows, at the cracks forming in the walls, at the vortex that seemed ready to consume everything, he realized he didn't have a choice. "Hayes, hold the line," he shouted, already turning toward the narrow passage they had entered through. "Hold the line?" Hayes snapped, firing at another advancing shadow. "Where the hell are you going?" "To fix this," Corbin shouted over his shoulder. "Don't let them get to Eleanor." Before she could argue, Corbin was gone, sprinting back through the tunnels. The air felt heavier now, as if the Nexus's energy was seeping into every corner of the labyrinth. The walls seemed to close in around him, the faint sound of whispers growing louder with each step. He tried to block them out, focusing on the path ahead. He knew the way back to the surface, but even as he ran, doubt gnawed at him. Could he even retrieve the dagger in time? And if he did, would it truly be enough to stop the Nexus? Or was he about to make everything worse? Corbin's car skidded to a halt at the edge of the quarry, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. He didn't bother turning off the engine as he jumped out, grabbing the shovel he had left in the trunk. The moon hung high overhead, casting a pale light over the jagged, overgrown pit. He scrambled down into the quarry, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he descended. The spot where he had buried the dagger was still marked by the disturbed earth, though the ground seemed to have settled slightly in the days since. Corbin didn't waste any time. He drove the shovel into the dirt, digging with a speed and desperation he didn't know he possessed. Minutes felt like hours as he worked, the sweat pouring down his face despite the cool night air. Finally, the blade of the shovel struck something solid. Corbin tossed the shovel aside and dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt with his hands until he uncovered the lockbox. He pried it open and pulled the dagger free. The instant his fingers wrapped around the hilt, he felt it again, that pull, that whisper. The dagger seemed to hum in his hand, its symbols glowing faintly as if it recognized him. Corbin shoved the feeling aside and climbed out of the pit, his legs burning from the effort. He had no time to waste. He gunned the engine and sped back toward the city, the dagger resting on the passenger seat beside him. Every second felt like an eternity, the distance between the quarry and the tunnel stretching endlessly in his mind. He had to get back. He had to. When Corbin re-entered the chamber, the scene was chaos. Hayes was backed into a corner, her empty gun now a blunt weapon as she swung it at the encroaching shadows. Dr. Price was still crouched by the pedestal, her hands glowing faintly as she traced symbols into the air, her face streaked with sweat and tears. "I've got it," Corbin shouted, holding up the dagger. Dr. Price's head snapped up, her eyes lighting with a mix of relief and urgency. "Bring it here. Quickly." Corbin charged forward, dodging and weaving through the shadows as they reached for him with claw-like appendages. One of them grazed his arm, and a searing cold shot through his body, but he didn't stop. He reached the pedestal and slammed the dagger into its slot. The effect was immediate. The chamber was flooded with blinding light, the symbols on the walls flaring to life in a cascade of colors. The vortex let out a deafening roar, its edges collapsing inward as the dagger's glow intensified. The shadows shrieked, their forms unraveling as the light consumed them. The ground shook violently, cracks spiderwebbing through the stone floor. Dr. Price screamed something, but Corbin couldn't hear her over the chaos. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her away from the pedestal as the Nexus began to collapse. Hayes was already at the far end of the chamber, waving frantically for them to follow. "Move, move, move!" Hayes shouted. They ran, the chamber crumbling behind them as the light of the Nexus grew brighter and brighter. By the time they reached the surface, the roar had faded, replaced by an eerie, deafening silence. Corbin collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving as he stared up at the night sky. The dagger was gone, consumed by the Nexus along with the shadows and the vortex. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air felt still. Dr. Price sat beside him, her hands trembling. "It's done," she whispered, though her voice was tinged with uncertainty. "I think it's done." Corbin didn't respond. He wasn't sure he believed her. The Nexus was sealed, but the city's darkness wasn't gone. It never would be. But for now, at least, it was quiet. And that would have to be enough. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Corbin hadn't returned to the precinct. He hadn't even answered the dozen calls Hayes left on his phone, each one more urgent than the last. He needed space, time to think, though in truth, he wasn't sure he'd ever make sense of what had happened. The Nexus, the dagger, the shadows, they felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare, but the weight they left behind was all too real. He spent most of his time in his apartment, staring out the window at the city below. It looked the same, bustling streets, honking cars, lives moving forward, but Corbin couldn't see it the way he used to. He knew what was beneath it now. What had always been there, waiting. That knowledge changed everything. He could never look at the city the same way again. On the third day, he finally answered Hayes' call. "About time," she said, her voice clipped but not unkind. "You've been ghosting me. Don't tell me you've been sitting at home feeling sorry for yourself." Corbin smirked faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Something like that." "Well, get up. We've got work to do." Corbin blinked, caught off guard. "Work?" "The Costellos," Hayes said. "They're regrouping faster than we expected. There's talk of a new leader stepping in, someone even nastier than Izzy. We've got leads to chase, people to put behind bars. You remember how to do that, right?" For a moment, Corbin didn't answer. Part of him wanted to say no, to tell her that the world they knew, the world of crime and justice and rules, felt laughably small after what they'd faced. But another part of him, the part that had spent years fighting for this city, wouldn't let him walk away. "Yeah," he said finally. "I remember." "Good," Hayes replied. "I'll pick you up in an hour." Corbin hung up and set the phone down, staring at it for a long moment. Then he stood, grabbed his coat, and headed for the door. The city wasn't going to fix itself, and if there was one thing Corbin knew, it was how to fight. Weeks passed, and life began to take on a strange semblance of normalcy. Corbin and Hayes threw themselves into their work, dismantling what remained of the Costello family piece by piece. It wasn't easy, nothing in this city ever was, but they made progress. Slowly, steadily, they chipped away at the darkness, even if they knew it would never truly disappear. Dr. Eleanor Price, on the other hand, vanished almost entirely. Corbin had tried to track her down a few times, but her office was empty, and her phone went straight to voicemail. A part of him wasn't surprised. She had been through as much as he had, if not more. Maybe she needed to find her own way to move forward, or maybe she knew things she wasn't ready to share. Either way, Corbin didn't push. He figured she'd resurface when she was ready. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that her absence wasn't just about healing. It was about preparation. She had seen the Nexus up close, understood its power better than anyone. And though they had sealed it, at least for now, Corbin suspected she wasn't convinced it was over. Neither was he. One night, months after the events in the tunnels, Corbin found himself walking the streets alone. It was late, the kind of late where the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for dawn. The air was cold, and the glow of streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. He wasn't sure why he had come out here. Maybe it was the restlessness, the gnawing sense that something was still unfinished. Or maybe it was just habit, the need to walk, to think, to feel the city around him. Whatever the reason, he ended up near the overpass, the place where it had all begun. The rusted gate was still there, though it was chained shut now, a warning sign hanging loosely from the metal links. Danger. Do not enter. Corbin stared at it for a long time, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. He thought about the tunnels, the pedestal, the dagger. About the shadows that had almost consumed them. And he thought about the Nexus. It was sealed, yes. But nothing stayed buried forever. Corbin knew that better than anyone. The city's darkness didn't disappear, it shifted, adapted, found new forms. The Nexus might have been quiet now, but quiet wasn't the same as gone. He could feel it in his bones, and the unease that never quite left him. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye. A flicker of movement in the shadows beneath the overpass. He froze, his pulse quickening, but when he turned back to look, the space was empty. Just darkness and cold air. Corbin exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the chill. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was a reminder. The city had secrets. Some of them were buried, others hidden in plain sight. And as long as Corbin was here, he would keep fighting to hold back the tide. Because that was what he did. What he had always done. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets and walked away, the faint sound of his footsteps fading into the night. The city didn't sleep. Neither did its darkness. But for now, it was quiet. And for Corbin, that was enough. For now.